Hello.
Let me just check my Zoom settings. Can you hear my audio? Okay, first of all.
Yes, I can.
Cool. All right, everything looks good.
Awesome. Well, hi and welcome. As you may remember from our emails, I'm Bella, and I'm very, very excited to have you this morning for our interview. For me, it's the morning. So
It's 2 p.m. here in America. I don't know if I told you I was in America.
Oh, no, you did. I just, so sorry if there are some birds outside in the morning. They're just going a bit wild at the moment, but
yeah. What type of birds are they? We've got Canadian geese outside, dozens of them.
I think I'm not quite sure entirely what they are. We have a lot of common miners, but I doubt they're making that noise. I'm not really sure. But sorry for getting distracted there. Thank you very much for joining me for this interview today.
Well, that's okay. It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
As you know, the topic for today's discussion is all about Stoicism and its recent resurgence. And you've mentioned, sorry, and now as you're a just give me a second. So
take your time, it's okay. I've got a cup of coffee here, which seems not fair. Do you need a glass of water or anything?
I'm all right. Sorry. I'm pretty poor interviewing, but I'm trying to get better.
Well, practice makes perfect. You know, I think you're doing great. So just keep going.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So, as you know, the topic for today is about Stoicism, its resurgence in recent years and that sort of stuff. So I was wondering if before that you have any questions about anything before the four that I have for you today.
No, I'm ready to go.
All right. So for my first question, I know that you're a cognitive behavioral therapist, and you've mentioned before how a lot of advice or exercises you've given to patients before have some basis in Stoicism. And I was wondering, obviously without, I guess, going into anything that is confidential, I was wondering if you could elaborate on some exercises that therapists in general may get their clients to partake in that are rooted in Stoic philosophy.
Well, the Stoics are Stoics, but they're also Socratics. So they were influenced by Socrates, who's an even more famous philosopher. He's the quintessential Athenian philosopher, as I like to say. And Socrates was famous partly because he had some ideas, like he had some doctrines or teachings that are pretty cool and influenced the Stoics. They also, more importantly, had a trademark method called the Socratic method of questioning. Or sometimes in Greek, it's called the alenkos, which means a method of cross-examination in a law court, but applied to philosophical doctrines. And we, in cognitive behavioural psychotherapy, so cognitive behavioural psychotherapy, as the name implies, is a mixture of cognitive therapy and behavioural therapy. And the cognitive side of it has a number of techniques, but the central part of the central strategy of cognitive therapy is called Socratic questioning. And it involves, rather than just telling clients stuff, often asking them questions that are designed to help them spot logical flaws or unfounded assumptions or contradictions in their own thinking, but in particular areas of that thinking, particularly in relation to value judgments or beliefs that control, that influence their emotions, because of the sort of beliefs that might make somebody feel depressed. So if I was thinking nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I think I'll go and eat worms, that would make me feel depressed, probably, right? And someone might ask me, well, what evidence? A cognitive therapist might say, what evidence do you have that nobody likes you, everybody hates you? And that would cause me to start reevaluating or challenging those beliefs, and I might discover that they're not entirely true. And that might change the way that I feel. It might make me feel a wee bit less depressed. So this method of Socratic questioning, as it's sometimes known, It's not exactly how Socrates did it. So Socrates' original approach had some advantages, but we know the Stoics did it. And we know the Stoics did it not because they actually talk about it that much, but because we see them doing it. So we have three main types of Stoic books. The Stoicism was founded in 301 BC, not by a Greek actually, but by a Phoenician merchant, a guy from Cyprus called Zeno of Citium, who was shipwrecked near Athens. So he founded the school in Athens, but he was a foreign immigrant, interestingly, at Athens. And we don't have any of his writings, but we have mainly the writings of three Stoics from later: Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus. And from Seneca, we have letters mainly, or essays. From Marcus Aurelius, we have his own personal journal or notes. But from Epictetus, we have transcripts of his lectures, talking to students, written down by one of his students, not by the man himself. And in those lectures, we can see him using the Socratic method to help his students overcome emotional turmoil and ethical dilemmas. So that would be the big example. And then there's loads and loads of other techniques. So some of them are kind of found in Stoicism only. Some of them are kind of similar to techniques. A big one, in my first book in Stoicism, which is called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, little plug there for my book, it happened, I tried to list them all as best I could. And actually, I forgot to count them. And years later, I thought, I'll go back and count them, because I remember I made a list. There are about 18 different strategies. So just to pick another one at random, we've got the Socratic method of questioning. Another one we call premeditatio malorum in Latin. There's also a Greek name for it that I can never remember. I'll come back to me in a bit. But we call it premeditation of adversity in English, and some people call it negative visualization. So the Stoics, particularly Seneca, goes on and on and on about this. He says every day, try and visualize all the bad things that could happen to you in life, but do it in order to rehearse a sense of studied indifference towards them, and to think about ways that you could cope with them emotionally. So to prepare yourself and build your emotional resilience by facing up to possible catastrophes like pandemics, or poverty or exile and stuff like that. And so, as an aside, people say to me, what would the Stoics say about how to cope with the pandemic? And I say, half joking, but half seriously, well, the Stoics would have told us that we should already have prepared for it. They would have said that before it happened, they should have said, you should be imagining what it might be like if a pandemic happens, buddy, so that when it does happen, it doesn't take you all by surprise and you all freak out. Like, who would have thought this would have ever happened? Yeah. Because these things happen. So this is very similar to a bunch of cognitive and behavioral therapy techniques with different names, annoyingly, but usually they're referred to as forms of what we call imaginal exposure. So exposing yourself in imagination, or exposing your imagination to feared or anxiety-provoking events so that you can rehearse coping with them, so your anxiety can wear off. And this is one of the most robust techniques in psychotherapy. And the Stoics knew about it. And you might think, well, maybe other people could have come up with that. So the Stoics really that brainy, because they were ahead of the game by 2,300 years, because I know maybe you're not that easily impressed, but I would point out that Sigmund Freud, who's a pretty famous dude in the field of psychotherapy, had no idea about this. And he became famous as a psychotherapist, and that wasn't that long ago. But the Stoics, 2,200 years before him, or more, 2,000, had figured this out, and it took us until now to rediscover it. In fact, they were right all that time ago. Yeah, you should visualize things and learn to, and that works. Yeah. Freud didn't know that worked, and people think he was a smart guy. So there you go. There's a couple of techniques.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I do agree. I have a lot of admirability for the Stoics because of that. They were ahead of the game by 2,000 years, and it's nice that they're picking up traction now.
Yeah.
On that note, though, I was wondering if you might be able to comment on Stoicism as a rare ancient philosophy as well that calls for women's education. So what kind of impact would you say that has had as well on its endurance throughout history?
I think that's an interesting question. It's one of my favorite questions. Someone just emailed me about that like 10 minutes ago, 10 minutes or so before I started talking to you, asking, are there women that write about Stoicism? What's the relationship between Stoicism and women? we don't know exactly what the role of the status of women was in relation to ancient philosophy. We've got a few fragments of information. It was a man's world, like, so most of the ancient authors are men, but we do hear about a handful of famous female philosophers. And again, I'd refer back to Socrates. Socrates is a very profound individual. He's a complex individual. There are mysteries about him, and there's depth and many aspects to his personality that makes him so interesting. So sometimes I like Socrates, would answer the question in what might seem like a kind of roundabout or a puzzling way. So when people say, where are all the women in ancient philosophy? I'd say, well, the best place to look for women in ancient philosophy isn't so much by looking at famous female philosophers, there's a couple of them, but by looking at a man, by looking at Socrates. Because if we look at Socrates, we realize that he taught philosophy to women because people used to believe that virtue was somehow innate. The aristocrats had virtue by birth, and it was mainly innately possessed by men. And Socrates said, no, I think virtue is a type of knowledge. And if it's a type of knowledge, it must be learnable. And therefore, anybody could learn it. Foreign immigrants, rich people, poor people, men, women, young people, old people. And that shook Athenian society. And we hear about Socrates doing philosophy with women, that he was inspired by some fascinating women, even his mother. He talks about being inspired by her in order to figure out. I mentioned earlier this method of questioning. Athenian men would follow in the profession that their father had. Socrates' father was called Sophroniscus, and he was a stonemason or a sculptor. And Socrates started off as a sculptor. And then one day he laid down his sculptor's tools, Socrates, and he left the workshop. And he said, I don't want to be a sculptor anymore. Instead, he said, half joking, he's always kind of half joking. He said, I want to follow instead in my mother's profession. I'm going to be a midwife. And people were like, that's crazy. What is he talking about? He said, but I'm not going to deliver babies from women. He said, I'm going to deliver from men and women knowledge, insight, by helping them to give birth to ideas. And I'm going to do that by questioning them using the Socratic method. So he said, I think of this as similar to what my mum did, like, except I help people to give birth to insights and wisdom rather than just helping them to give birth to babies. Like, but he seems to have been inspired in some ways by his mother and by other important Athenian women. The first one, by the way, so we're getting really deep. This is a deep dive, right? So bear with me on this for a minute. Socrates said in his trial, he blamed, in a sense, he blamed a woman. Like, he said, I'm doing philosophy because the god Apollo set me on this. I'm on a mission from God, he said in court. He said it was the god Apollo because his oracle, a woman called the Pythia, like that was her traditional title. There were many Pythias, but the Pythia at the time, the priestess of Apollo, would go into a trance and the god Apollo spoke through her, they believed, at Delphi, just outside Athens. And she said, no man is wiser than Socrates. And Socrates said, I feel like this was inevitably put me on this quest to discover the nature of wisdom and to find out if it was true. And so the god had basically given me this task. It's his fault that I'm doing philosophy, which is what you guys have picked me on trial for, ironically. But it was this woman, it was the Pythia, that he says it's because she said this that I ended up becoming a philosopher. The Pythia, over the centuries, made many pronouncements, and she spoke almost like a Zen master. She would come out with these short phrases, often in Greek only 2 words. There are 147 recorded words that survive. Plutarch, another philosopher, says that these little wise sayings or proverbs or maxims, we call them the Delphic maxims, he said they're like seeds from which philosophy grows. So the Pythia just says a couple of words, and he says people have written books many volumes long trying to interpret them. Now there are many of them, but the 2 most famous maxims from the Pythia, this woman, were carved, they were inscribed on pillars at the entrance to the temple of Apollo. And you may have heard of them in English. One of them is gonothai seauton, which in Greek, which in English means know thyself. It's very, very, very famous. Like, and it's almost like a theme that runs through Socratic philosophy. And the other one is Medan Agan, which means nothing too much or nothing in excess, which is similar to saying all things in moderation.
Yeah.
And that also is a theme that runs through the philosophy of Socrates and other ancient philosophers. So you can see those are just two words in each in Greek. They're like a droplet. And then philosophers went away and had whole debates about what does it mean to know thyself? What does it mean like to have all things in moderation and to exercise temperance? And like, what's it all about? Like, she planted seeds of philosophy. And we're also told that an earlier philosopher called Pythagoras, who was pre-Socratic, but also a big influence in the Stoics. So Zeno, the founder of Stoicism I mentioned earlier, wrote a book called On Pythagorean Questions, which is lost to us today. He wrote a whole book about an earlier philosopher called Pythagoras and his followers, the Pythagoreans. And Pythagoras was very influenced by the mystery religions and Greek mysticism. And he allegedly, we're told by several sources, that he went to the Temple of Apollo and he spoke to one of the priestesses there. And she taught him an ethical philosophy, which he then passed down to his students. He's one of the earliest philosophers. So the philosophical tradition in Greece arguably goes back to this mysterious woman, this priestess in Delphi, who taught Pythagoras, and then Pythagoras influenced Plato and many other subsequent philosophers. So one of the very earliest philosophers, like, and arguably one of the most influential ones was Pythia and the subsequent priestesses as well. So these women are kind of hidden in the shadows of Greek philosophy, but they exercise. The reason I've told you all these stories is just to give you the sense of how important the influence of these women was. And there were other women, Phenarete and the Pythia, like there are other famous women in Greece that are on the edge, but influencing, shaping the philosophy from the background. And this is true. Even now, I'll give you another example. Marcus Aurelius, who's a Roman emperor. I just wrote a biography of him. And the first two chapters of my biography are about his dear old mum, Marcus Aurelius's mum. So we don't hear much about her. But she was an intellectual. She was a very influential, very wealthy, powerful. She was a magnate in the construction industry in ancient Rome. She owned a brick and tile factory. So she was a very wealthy, powerful businesswoman, if you like. And she had a circle of intellectuals around her. She spoke fluent Greek, although she lived in Rome. And some of the leading intellectuals of the day came to her house. And so Marcus Aurelius grew up in this environment. And Roman women, although in some ways they're kind of in the shadows, one of the things that they did, through which people say they kind of exercised indirect power, was that they would choose the teachers for their children. And it seems likely that it was his mother, Domitia Lucilla was her name, that chose Stoics to educate Marcus Aurelius. She may have been friends with several Stoic philosophers. So she created the Stoic emperor. So she's kind of like, they say behind every great man's a great woman, like maybe more so in history. Like if we look a little bit further, like there may be some evidence of that gets overlooked sometimes. But the Stoics did say, because they were Socratics, they agreed with Socrates that because virtue is a form of wisdom, it must be teachable, and therefore women and men should be able to learn it alike. And so we know that Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoic school, who was a student of Zeno, wrote a book called, some of the book titles actually are almost statements of philosophy in themselves. He wrote a book called That Virtue is the Same in Men and Women. And so clearly this is influenced by Socrates. We don't even know what that book says, but the title tells us something. And then we know that Musonius Rufus, who was a teacher of Epictetus in the 1st century AD, he was a Roman, what's called a Roman knight or an equestrian, a Roman nobleman. We have 2 surviving lectures by him about how philosophy should be taught to women or girls, as well as to boys. And so the Stoics, this seems to be something that they were known for to some extent. We also hear about Pythagoreans who were women. Often we hear the names of women, the students of Pythagoras. With other schools of philosophy, there's a problem, because they usually conducted philosophy in what are called the gymnasia, or the recreational grounds in ancient Athens, where this seems odd today, but they had these parks where boys would wrestle and practice dancing and practice running, like sports grounds or recreational grounds. But people also did philosophy there. They would give speeches and things like that. But those recreational grounds were not open to women. So women couldn't even go to the places where philosophy was often being done, with some exceptions. Now, the Stoics didn't do philosophy in the gymnasia. They did it in the centre of Athens, in the Agora. And there were also some restrictions on women going there, but it's possible that women were able to attend some of the Stoic lectures, or they found out about Stoicism in other ways. So, and there are many women who are interested in Stoicism today, particularly in academia. What we don't have, what's missing, is a female Ryan Holiday. You know, Ryan Holiday is the most successful author who writes popular books on Stoicism. Yeah. But there's not a woman who writes books about Stoicism that's as successful as that. So maybe if you're into Stoicism, one day you could be the female Ryan Holiday and write millions of people might read your books about Stoicism.
Maybe. I'm really interested in it, and it's very interesting to learn about. So I certainly didn't know about it before, probably last year. It's very, very interesting, and I can see probably more in future now that it is picking up. Possibly more female writers will maybe pick it up and start writing about it as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, thank you very much for that. Now, I was watching a previous interview that you did for a Deep Talks event in January of last year, so around exactly a year ago, in regards to the Stoic response to anger. And you touched on the fact that the ancient Stoics were prominently pantheists, which I know isn't related to the anger, but I thought that might jog memory if you had one of the event.
I vaguely remember it. Yeah, I've done a lot of interviews. I think I've done well over 100, but I kind of remember that one, I think.
So with that in mind, one key difference, of course, between then, I guess, Stoicism then and now is that modern Stoics aren't so much pantheists. We've kind of diverted from that due to just differences in religion, science, and technology, but people still practice Stoicism. So aside from that major change in faith, I guess if you'll call it that, or belief, what other major changes have you observed or know of in regards to the application of Stoicism over time? So we have pantheism and cognitive behavioural therapy, for example. Are there any other ones that you can think of?
That's a little bit hard because in some ways we know a lot about Stoicism and in other ways we don't. I'd say in relation to pantheism, it's true that people don't worship Zeus anymore. Not much anyway. Some people do. But the idea of pantheism, the kind of metaphysical side of it, is still influential today in a different form. So the idea of pantheism is that the whole universe is like one big living organism, and we're all kind of like part of a greater whole. And so this idea is kind of like holism today. The idea that human beings could be seen as like cells within the body of some larger entity, some greater whole, is kind of still relevant, like I think today. But we wouldn't think of it as conscious in the way that the ancient Stoics did, or maybe some people would actually. But we wouldn't necessarily think of it as conscious in the way that the ancient Stoics did. But the idea of being part of something bigger, I think, is still a useful way of looking at things, because for some reason, we tend to forget that. Like, we think of ourselves as being atomistic individuals, isolated from our environment and isolated from mankind as a whole. Like, and the Stoics thought that was a kind of alienation. They thought it caused suffering and it caused moral problems, and that by learning to see ourselves as part of a community, part of humankind, and part of the world as a whole, we could restore our equanimity, and our perspective on life would be more rational. So that has that changed? Yes and no. Like, the bits of it that are still relevant. The Stoics, we don't know a great deal about Stoic logic. In some ways, Stoic logic is believed to be more akin to modern logic than Aristotelian logic, its greatest rival was. But we probably have different ideas. We're more sophisticated model of logic that we use today. So there's been progress in that regard. The Stoics had physiological theories about the human body and about animals and so on that are probably kind of dated now, but nobody really holds them too much to that, because we think, of course, ancient writers are going to have primitive scientific ideas. At first, they thought the human consciousness was located in the heart. And then actually over time, they started to think it was located in the brain. Actually, they say something quite strange about that. They say the human mind is like an octopus and its tentacles spread throughout the body, which is odd because it sounds almost like a description of the central nervous system and the nerves going through the body. So, but they had primitive science. So we don't hold that too much against them. The more problematic part would be, I guess, the psychology and the ethical differences. So they lived in a culture that had different views about sexuality, about slavery, about politics. And so we would regard, although in some ways the Stoics were progressive, in other ways they were kind of conservative and outdated by modern standards. And so I think many people today would think the Stoics would need to consider animal rights more, with the rights of children more, the rights of women more. And many of these prejudices, on the other hand, are really reflections of the culture in which they lived, rather perhaps than the philosophy itself. I mean, as I'm saying that, I think, you know, at the same time, the Stoics were known for their cosmopolitan ethic, which they have this principle that we should view all conscious beings as being part of a single kingdom or community. And that would mean viewing foreigners and, you know, rich and poor and men and women and children as really brothers and sisters. And in many ways, the Stoicism influenced and was a precursor of Christian ethics in that regard. It's the bridge between pagan culture and philosophy and early Christian ethics, in a sense. But those are some areas I think things are different. I'll give you a real technique that I can think of an important difference in terms of psychology, but it's a little bit of a technical point, but it's an important one maybe. The Stoics had a limited understanding. I think arguably they acknowledge this indirectly. They're not completely oblivious to it, but I think they have a limited understanding of the problem that psychologists today would call ruminative thinking. So sometimes people overthink things. And, you know, we see this with people worry too much, for example, or if they're depressed, they go round and round in circles, thinking about depressing stuff repetitively. And the Stoics want to use thinking to solve emotional problems, and they're right about that in many regards, but they're not perhaps fully aware of some of the potential risks of relying too much on verbal thinking or reasoning, that, for example, it could, if you're not careful, it can turn into pathological worrying. So that's a bit of a technical point, but that's a slight difference between Stoic therapy and modern therapy, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that. And for my last question, what would you think were, or perhaps still are, the most Stoic ideas or exercises that you've had to revisit since the start of the ongoing COVID pandemic? You mentioned premeditatio malorum would probably be a good one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one way of doing that is that we should prepare for the next pandemic. Because I think, in a sense, terrible as the current pandemic is, and I think in some ways the media have confused people a lot about the medical research, and you know, I'd like to see more of a platform for virologists and epidemiologists to communicate with the public, rather than politicians and social media influencers getting in the way, maybe spreading misinformation online. But I think we got off lightly this time round, because awful bad as the pandemic is and bad as COVID-19 is, it could have been much worse. And we've shown that as a society we're very badly prepared to deal with a virus like this, a pandemic. So we were lucky it wasn't like Ebola, a virus that kills 50% of people. Potentially, like that, then we would have been in much more serious trouble even than we are. So maybe what we should be doing is thinking at some point in the future, there's probably going to be a worse pandemic than this. And how would we cope with that? Could the global community maybe collaborate together more? Could scientists maybe be given more of a voice? Like, what's actually going to protect society against more serious and viral threats in the future? So I think the Stoics would say that's obviously the wise thing to do, and that would be a form of premeditatio malorum. But also the view from above, is important, which is broadening our perspective. The Stoics sense to something that we know in modern psychology, which is that when people are highly emotional, the scope of their attention tends to become narrow, and that amplifies their problems. It's like we put a laser beam focus on the things that, if you're angry, you'll probably focus narrowly in on the aspects of someone's behavior that you're angry about. And then you'll maybe be ignoring. So somebody just called you, I said some terrible insulting thing to you. They called you a muppet or something like that. They said you're a terrible person, you're a terrible idiot, probably on Twitter, right, or somewhere. And you just focusing on that, and you get really upset about it. But maybe that person was really nice to you the day before, and maybe they helped an old lady across the street the day before that, and but you're forgetting all of the possible positive things or more constructive things, and maybe just focusing exclusively on the one bad thing that they did when you're really angry. And the Stoics think, well, we need to broaden our perspective and think about people's character as a whole, and also think about life as a whole and our place within it, in order to have a more balanced and more rational way of responding emotionally. So I think the view from above is an important strategy for coping with stress in the pandemic or whenever.
I think especially as well that when so many of us have been made to be cooped up with our family or whoever we live with for such a long time, as much as you love them, they can get under your skin, and you can do the same to them. So I can understand that. And I think as well, a memento mori, because it's everywhere. People are passing away a lot because of COVID, and just remembering that it is going to happen, it's inevitable, I think, as well as a great one. But thank you for touching on the view from above. I really appreciate that. That's a really good one as well.
Cool.
And that was everything that I had for today. I really appreciate your time for this interview today, and I'm very grateful basically for your time, and I really appreciate your answers. They were very, very insightful. So yeah, thank you very much for joining me. I will be uploading this to my YouTube channel, and it'll probably take like an hour or two, but if that's something you wanted to view or keep note of, you definitely can.
Yeah. Well, I want to take issue with something that you said earlier now in retrospect, because at the beginning you told me that you were very confident in your ability as an interviewer, like, because you hadn't done a lot of interviews, like, but I thought you did a really good job, and it was a pleasure, and I thought your questions were very thoughtful and very insightful. So I think with practice people get much better at things like interviewing, and you've already demonstrated you've got the ability. So I would encourage you to do more interviews like this, and you'll get so polished and confident and skillful at it that before long you'll be doing it in your sleep.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you. This is my second interview, so there's still some tinglies, but with practice, like you say, I'll get through. I'll get better.
Yeah, you already got better. Like you're on a roll. So yeah, you should do some more. And good luck with everything. And let me know. You're going to put this interview online, or?
It will be on my YouTube channel just for reference, mostly for me to write the transcript later. But I might be including quotes from you or any information that you have mentioned in my assessment, as it's on like the resurgence of Stoicism and things that have changed or stayed largely the same throughout time.
There is a resurgence of Stoicism. I think it's ancient philosophy is the future, I like to say. Yeah,
because human nature hasn't changed much despite our context.
That's right. it's very interesting how relevant Marcus Aurelius in particular seems today. Like, we face the same kind of problems, and the same solutions seem helpful. So
Yeah.
good. And then if you want me to, I can share the link to your YouTube, the video on social media. If you want more people to see it, just let me know.
All right. Well, I appreciate that, but it's totally up to you. It would be good though you can plug your book via as well. So I'll be doing that in the description, of course. But
awesome.
But yeah, so thank you very, very much. I really appreciate the time for today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Like I say, good luck with everything.